Doet hij het? Test, test. Hij doet het. Nou, Quinn. Daar gaat hij.
Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I do have an image now. Can you see me as well?
I cannot see you.
Oh well, we still have to establish a connection, but I can see you. Looking for my face, but at least you can hear me. I'm glad that worked out.
There we go.
Hi there. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you. Well, I sent you the questions, and the purpose of the interview, inspire my readers, learn everything about the competing values framework for education, and how it works in education. You gave it a different name in education, and to see whether there are best practices and tools which my readers and teachers in the Netherlands can use for their own classroom practice, because that's my main focus: classroom practice and science. So before we start, do you have any questions for me?
No, I think that was very clear and that your list was very good.
Thank you. Well, let's start. I made a few sections, and the first section is really about your work, and I see two bookshelves behind you, and it looks really well. It's at least a couple of hundred books. So my first question is, what kind of books are in your bookshelves, and what persons or people inspire you as a scientist and as a person?
Well, the books I read tend to be about organizational change and about leadership and culture and related kinds of things. And I've always had a very, very deep interest in teaching. In fact, I see teaching and leadership as kind of overlapping ideas.
All right, so could you name a couple of titles that really have inspired you, or some writers?
I think that the path of least resistance is a book that was written about 20 years ago, Robert Fritz. And in it, he made some very basic observations about nature following the path of least resistance, and that one of the most powerful questions we could ask is, what result do we want to create? That is, when we clarify a purpose, it takes us away from a reactive state. And I was very, very influenced by his work on that topic.
Nice. Interesting. I will have a look. So when you look back on your own school career, what did it look like? What feelings what memories does it bring back? Were you surrounded by highly effective teachers, for example?
I would say probably not. Um, I think that highly effective teachers are pretty rare, and that they exist out there. But you're very, very lucky and very blessed when you find one.
All right. So during your whole high school career, there was no single teacher who inspired
Yeah,
you to become who you
yeah.
are now.
There were a handful of teachers that at various stages made a great deal of difference, and they were the exceptions. And I'm very grateful to them.
And what was it that made them really inspirational for you? Because you've done so much research on, well, let's say, being an inspirational leader. What was it that made those teachers inspirational for you?
Yeah. I think that if I had to boil it down to one single word, that word would be authentic. Um, you can typically identify two or three teachers in high school out of all the many teachers you had, and you say, those are really, really great teachers. And you say, are they exactly the same? No, they had different styles. But every one of them knew who they were, and they cared in a way that was very authentic, and you could feel it, and you would respond to it.
So would they showed similarities to the teachers you mentioned in your book, for example?
Yes, that's true.
And let's be clear, the best teacher in you I'm talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Um, well, somehow you discovered your purpose in life, and purpose is a really important word in all of your works. When
Yes.
did you discover your purpose? When was that moment? And what was it, that specific purpose?
Um, when uh, when I was in undergraduate in college, um, I they handed me 101 this and 101 that, and it was very alienating. I'd had some experiences prior to that were much more meaningful, and I started to get depressed as an undergraduate. And I thought, I've got to figure out what I want to major in here and what I want to do when I grow up. And so I did a lot of work trying to figure the answer to that question. And one day when I was wrestling with it, a question occurred to me. And the question was, up until now, what's the most significant thing you've ever done? And it was actually pretty easy to answer that question. It's when I'd helped people make changes in their lives. And as I thought about that, there was this voice in my head that said, major in change. And on the one hand, that was very exciting. On the other hand, it was very problematic because there was no major in change. But suddenly, I was seeing education from a very unique perspective. I started to make rules, and one of the rules, for example, was I'll never again take a course. I'll only take teachers. In other words, I wouldn't take any professors who weren't great teachers. And that's very hard to do because you have to fight the system to get into those classes. I began to read books about change that were just on the market that weren't assigned, which I had never done before. I would go to public lectures on topics of change. And what happened was I graduated in sociology, but really what I did is I had a major in change. And so when I went to graduate school, I continued to focus on change.
What age are we talking? How old were you?
I was an undergraduate in college, so I was about 21, 22.
Right.
And so when I finished, then I did research on change, I taught change, I did consulting on change. That one word integrated all my life and made it very synergistic.
All right, well, that's a clear answer. Change is a relatively new field of research, isn't it? I talked to Professor Leon de Calloway, maybe you know his name. He wrote a book, Learning to Change, and he has a color theory. Pretty. You also work with the colors, but he defined leadership in 5 colors, and he told me it's really a new area, whereas psychology or science is really goes back centuries. So it was really hard to get inspired by professors who were specialized in this field. And nowadays, I think there's many professors and many people who specialize in this subject. So it must have been quite a search for you to find your direction. So you are really a subject of your books as well, almost.
That's right.
Yeah, nice. Well, let's go to education in the United States. Um, if you look at today's education in the United States, what's the current state of education? How would you describe it?
Um, I would probably say chaos. The There's just so much conflict about what should be happening, what shouldn't be happening, and enormous variation of philosophies and practices, and just it's in many ways very discouraging.
Well, let me specify because it's really broad. It's a really broad question.
It's
Let's say you had to name 3 items that really need change. 3 subjects in education.
Yeah, I'd say that the um, for me there's sort of one burning change, and that is around teacher development. The kinds of things you're interested in terms of classroom practices, etc. I think that the potential is very, very high, but people don't see it. And what they see are the constraints, and it's very, very hard to get them to envision the possibilities around teacher development.
By people, you mean teachers?
Teachers, policymakers, principals, everybody.
So, well, that's an issue we have to work on. Another issue. How about equity, equality in education?
And I think that that's been around for a long time, continues to be around. I think it's a very difficult one, but certainly a big issue.
The reason, one of the reasons I wrote you a letter is because in the Netherlands we have many school leaders who were once teachers themselves, and I think that's a good quality.
Yeah.
The thing is, in some occasions it just stops there. They become a school leader, and then I think they do not have the proper equipment to manage change, and I think that's really dangerous. If you were a teacher in the past and now you're a school leader, change should be a mandatory subject for every school leader. So how do we guarantee as a school system that all school leaders possess these change qualities? How do you do it?
The the parallel I see between teaching and business, I believe that in the typical corporation, the conventional manager is not a leader. I extend that all the way to the CEOs. There are many CEOs who are not leaders. They make assumptions of management, and what they're really about is problem solving. They're trying to restore the system to equilibrium. And so it's all about conflict avoidance. There are a handful of people who become leaders in corporations, and they're almost always in small supply. When I look at the work we did on the school teachers in the Best Teacher in Your book, that was an exhilarating experience because we had access to the top 1 or 2% of the teachers in the state of Ohio, as objectively measured by value-added scores. Talking to those people was incredibly exciting because they were not conventional teachers. And we knew that before we even talked to them, because by sheer fact that by definition they were in the top 1 or 2%, they were moving students much further than others. And how do you do that? How do you move a student twice as much as a conventional teacher? You can't work twice as hard, because conventional teachers work very hard. Yeah. And so we knew before we ever went there that they were transformational leaders. Now, they would die if you called them that, because that's a strange language to them. But that's in fact what they were. And they didn't think like other teachers. They didn't act like other teachers. They were operating by an entirely different theory. And the same thing happens in companies, in these rare occasions where people actually become transformational influencers. And so I think as we articulate what that means and what these people look like, we open a door for a higher level of imagination and aspiration that simply is not there in public schools or in corporations. They just don't have that imagery.
If you want to change the system, you told me it's just the top 1%, it's a really small percentage of the total amount of teachers. That means there are more teachers around that don't really understand the basics of change or teaching at all. So where do you start? Are you going to inspire by showing this 1%, or are you going to take measures to change the bigger whole? Because I can imagine when you're a policymaker and you see, okay, 1% is a highly effective teacher, 99% is not, I'm going to focus on 99%. Where do you start as a policymaker when you know only 1% is highly effective? The people which you described in your book.
Yeah. That's exactly what happens. They focus on the 90% that are struggling in some way. And for example, one of the teachers we interviewed, she said, I'm retiring in a year. And I've been teaching like this for a very long time. And so long before these value-added measures came out, I was this kind of teacher. And yet, in 30 years of teaching, never once has an administrator ever showed up in my classroom to say, what are you doing? Right? Now, we have to stop and ask, well, why is that? Why would that administrator never show up? And the answer is he has work to do. He has lots of problems to solve. He's got complaints from parents. He's got teachers who are making big mistakes. And that scenario holds generally for all systems, not just education, but all systems. They focus on where the problems are. And it would never occur to them to say, where is excellence and how do we replicate excellence? The human attention, we know from science, is drawn to the negative and to the problems that exist. And when we do focus on the other side of the curve, people become defensive. They say, well, that's not possible. And they start arguing against it. But if we're going to change the systems, my own personal bias is we'll do it by focusing on what I call positive deviance or excellence, not by focusing on problem solving.
That means you have to facilitate administrators with a lot more time to visit classrooms. Am I right?
Either that or change how they think. So, for example, if I were to say to an administrator, what result do you want to create? Why do you exist? Why do you get up in the morning? He or she would probably say, well, I want to have a good school district. I want to have great teachers. if I then say, well, what are you doing to produce that? Then they're going to have a kind of hard time answering that question. But they're not against excellence, at least not consciously. But again, when we studied these teachers, we would bring them together in workshops, and they would say, why am I here? And we'd say, well, because of your value-added scores. And they'd say, well, what value? What scores? And we said, well, hasn't your principal shared with you that you're an outstanding teacher? And the answer was, no, they haven't. And
Wow.
when you'd call up the principals and say, tell me about Mrs. Jones, he'd say, oh, she's a great teacher. Well, she has value-added scores. Have you given them to her? Well, no. Well, why not? Well, I don't want her to know about that. Well, what do you mean you don't want her to know about that? Well, I don't want to cause any conflict.
Wow.
Now, that's so interesting. Now,
What kind of conflict is he referring to?
This was large numbers of principals.
Well, what kind of conflict would they be referring to then?
If you are a superb teacher and you're off the scale,
Yes.
and all these other teachers aren't, then we have a fear there's going to be conflict. So the administrator, his purpose or her purpose is to avoid conflict.
I see.
It's to avoid problems. He or she doesn't stop and say, well, if I've got the best teacher in the district in this building, how could I use her to spread excellence? That question never occurs to anybody. That's not where their minds are.
I see. Yesterday I interviewed Michael Fullen. Maybe you know him from Ontario. He does a lot of research on educational change. And he mentioned in his book, The New Meaning of Educational Change, that superintendents and district administrators hardly have time to focus on the principles of classroom teachers because they're only problem solving. And that makes it a big problem. So why don't we attack those problems for those superintendents or districts administrators? Because there's clearly a big problem there. And you've told them, Michael Fullen has told them, Peter Senji has told them, many professionals have made their case strong, I think, supported by research, but still nothing changes. What happens?
All of us, every single one of us, has a preference for our comfort zone. That is, we're committed to learning that's incremental and easy. And if I do something to you or you do something to me that requires me to go out of my comfort zone and engage in what I call deep learning, I've become very resistant to that. Learning makes me uncomfortable. And we're dealing with very basic fundamentals of human nature. Now, when you mention those people you just mentioned and their books, there is something that we should remember, and that is the message doesn't go entirely unheard. Somebody over here gets it, and someone over here gets it, and they begin to do things, and experiments happen. Now that curve is very flat, very slow, but it is happening, and people innovate and they try things, and the message also gets stronger. And so it's important to recognize that not a lot's happening, but some things are happening.
Are you positive for the future? Do you believe it's going to change the system as a whole? In, let's say, 10 years, we must have some goal somewhere.
I don't know if it's 10 years, but I think that's probably getting close. That if you look, for example, just at positive psychology and the work going on there, and the amount of interest around the world in trying to apply it in schools, there's a lot. You go to those conferences, and there's just a lot of people trying things because people are looking, to get better. there will always be large-scale resistance, but there will also be progress.
What I don't understand is that most of the most important educational research comes from the United States. I talked to Richard Ryan, for example, with his self-determination theory, and a lot of educational theories come from the United States and which are applied in many schools in Europe. But the United States itself, they don't manage to be excellent. So sometimes I'm a bit confused. When I go to any university here in Holland, we learn about your theories. We learn about learning screws from Peter Senge. We learn about the self-determination theory. So in the United States, you have all these resources and all these tremendous researches, and still it doesn't happen in American education. I just don't get it. How come?
Maybe an analogy would be helpful. There's no topic in history of social science that's been researched more than leadership. And yet, if you look across the companies in the United States or outside the United States, the leadership is very discouraging. And the teaching, it's the same thing, that those theories of various sorts, those innovations and experiments in this innovative school or that innovative school, it leads to lots of argumentation and very small steps forward. And I think it's a characteristic of the human condition. But again, I think we are making those small steps forward.
That's good to hear.
I would not argue with your assumption about things are in bad condition.
No, I think it's just that when we talk about educational science, 90% of science comes from the United States. If you look at literature that's used here in teacher education, it's all United States and not too much from Europe. I don't know any Finnish researcher, whereas Finland has an excellent education system. But I don't know any research from Finland. I only know they have a really good system. So somehow they managed to have an excellent system without having all this extensive research that you do in the United States. So that's what really amazes me.
Yeah, I think that one factor on that particular example is homogeneity. When you go into the Nordic countries, for example, that do so well on so many things. I have a close friend who's an economist. He told me a story last year about he was flying into Sweden, and there was an article that he read in the paper, and it was about a survey where they'd asked if people were willing to pay more taxes. And to his shock, the answer was yes, which would never happen in the United States. And so he met with his economist friend from Sweden, and he started asking him, and the economist said, well, of course we would pay more taxes, don't I? And my friend was just in shock. And finally he said, now, are you telling me that if the Swedish government had one more dollar of yours, you would expect them to spend that wisely? And he said, well, of course. He said, of course, he said, I realized we lived in two entirely different worlds. Because in the United States, you would never assume they'd spend that dollar wisely. Now, when the people do research on those kinds of tax dimensions, one of the big variables is homogeneity. And when you get very diverse societies, it's very hard for people to trust each other. And the poor people expect to lose out. It's just very hard in diverse countries.
I see. Well, let's move to the book, The Best Teacher in You, which really was a great inspiration for me as a teacher. Because as I told you before, I have read many books. I've interviewed many scientists which really inspire me, like Fullen, like John Hattie, like Marzano, and they have really published some excellent, comprehensive research. The only thing is it's sometimes too comprehensive. I really just don't know where to start. It's so much, and with your theory, which we will talk about soon, um, I start at where I am. And it's really clear to me where I am and where my neighbor is and where the guy in the other classroom is, and it's really clear where his and her qualities are, and that's really, I think that's really unique in this system. So thank you for that. Um, so let's start there. Um, the competing values framework has been really important in corporate life and applied in many countries by many leaders. And then you suddenly realized, hey, there's education. Education needs me. How did the idea start to write this book?
Um, it actually started with a phone call. Two of my colleagues that I wrote with are from Battelle for Kids, which is a think tank in Ohio. And one of them called me up and he said, "You don't know me, but let me tell you what I've been doing." And he talked about all the work they've been doing on the value-added teachers. And he said, we started doing the workshops and the interviews and making lists of characteristics of these value-added teachers. He said, and it got discouraging because the list didn't look very different than other lists in education. And he said, I began to get discouraged, but then I remembered when I was in graduate school studying the competing values model. And he said, I began to suspect that it had something to do with the competing values model. And so we had a very long talk and described the people he was studying. And I said, well, I'd like to come down and interview some of those teachers because I immediately had some suspicions. And after a few interviews, it got very clear that the competing values model really was operating. Teachers have different orientations. One teacher may be very much into control, another may be into innovation, messiness, and change. Another one may be into loving the kids, another into achievement, and so forth. But if you understand that, begin to use the model to understand it, then you can begin to see what it is that crosses the quadrants and what principles are operating. And so as we started to do that, a lot of things just came into focus, and it made a great sense.
When you started the research, was it always the purpose to integrate or to translate the competing values framework for education, or did it just happen?
My first interest was because we had access to the top 1 or 2%. To me, that was the golden opportunity. And I had strong suspicions of that notion I said earlier, that when we went and interviewed those people, what we would find is that the people at the top of the scale think entirely differently than the conventional teacher. And that's because they're transformational in their influence. And so that was my first interest. But almost immediately, the competing values implications started to become clear as well. And so they sort of unfolded together.
Why did you give it a different name then? The Battelle for Kids framework, or the BFK framework?
Yeah. That was basically just because they were already starting to do work at BFK and using the basic ideas, it was just an extension of what they were doing, and I had no problem with them calling it the BFK framework.
All right. And are there any significant differences between the BFK framework and the competing values framework?
The underlying framework is, the basic notions are the same. The words on the framework change a little bit because it's teaching practice as opposed to management or leadership practice. And so in terms of the basic notions, no. In terms of some of the language, yes.
I see. And I wrote you this question. If you had to explain your framework to a 12-year-old kid, what would that sound like? The BFK framework, if you had to explain it to a class of 12-year-old children.
That's a really good question. Um, let me try a slightly different answer, or to answer a slightly different question, but it I think may satisfy the need you're expressing. Often when we are introducing the competing values framework in any area, we'll do a little exercise. And what we have is a deck of cards. And there are 4 different colors, red, green, yellow, blue. And on them are written things from that quadrant. And so if they're managers, it'll be I do accounting and I do this or that for the red quadrant, or I see new visions for the green quadrant. And then we say, okay, here's a random set of cards. Your job is to trade with other people in the room and get cards you like and get rid of the ones you don't like. And so you've got 10 minutes to make as many trades as possible. And so they begin trading, and someone who's red starts to pick up red cards, and someone who's blue gets blue cards. And then we stop them and we say, would all of you who have mostly blue cards go stand in that corner, go stand in this corner. And then we say, all the blue people, we'd like to have you introduce yourselves to the yellow people. What's on your cards? Oh, achievement, getting things done, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have the people in the yellow quadrant explain what's on their cards. Well, teamwork and listening to people. And so they immediately they build a group identity within seconds. So then we ask them, in the blue group, we'd like you to think for a couple minutes about how it is that yellow people destroy value in this organization. And yellow people, how do blue people destroy value? And so on for green and red. And then we'll go around and say, okay, what's your answer? And they get very funny, and they talk about how blue people are horrible. And it goes around the circle. And then we'll say to them, okay, now we'd like to use the room as a map. So each corner is the color you've been talking from. Go stand in the place in the room that represents the culture of your organization right now. And so they start moving around, they go stand someplace, then we have to ask them to tell us their story. And then where would you like the culture to be in the future? Now, all of that is lots of laughter and lots of fun and games. But when we have them sit down, we really haven't said a word about the model, but they already understand it. And then we say, what's the implications of the model? And they immediately say, well, you have to have all of it. And then we'll ask questions like, then why do you have so much conflict over these things in the real world? Now, that answer doesn't answer the 12-year-old question, although you could do it with 12-year-olds.
It's a great way to clarify the model, yes.
I didn't hear that.
It's a great way to bring the model into practice. And are you finished then? Does it work? Do they know what to do, or it's just a teaser to start to get going?
It's usually a teaser, but we immediately have other exercises that we build on it. So, for example, we might give them a real problem and say we want 4 people in each group, and each person represents only one quadrant. So you can only talk from a green perspective and a red perspective and a blue. Now go ahead and solve the problem. And invariably, what happens is they say our conversation was so much richer than usual because instead of immediately going to one place, we diversified our thought before we simplified it. Therefore, you have richer solutions. And so there are a variety of exercises that we do to help people basically diversify their thinking and then integrate their thinking across the quadrants. And almost always that leads to creative insights.
Would you say this model is scientifically proven?
There have been many studies of competing values, and they tend to hold up the basic aspects of the model. There was one study that they argued that it didn't hold up, and we responded saying that there were some flaws in the way that they went about it. But in terms of the cognitive differentiations between those four quadrants, those tend to hold up all the time, and allows people to make sense of the world from it.
The reason I'm asking is because in Holland, the word or the expression evidence-based is really hot. Everything we do should be evidence-based. And the reason I'm asking you is, when do you define anything as evidence-based? When is something evidence-based?
I think that as soon as one researcher does one study and they have some finding, they say this is evidence-based. The fact that 10 other researchers come by and challenge the work gets lost somehow. Now, I'm not making light of evidence-based. I think evidence-based is important. But I also think that excellence in teaching requires very complex thought, and that evidence-based is valuable and helpful, but doesn't really get us there, because you've got to do a lot more than just have some facts.
One question I ask you is, how do you make sure American policy is evidence-based, assuming that it is, especially for policymakers, that their theories that they apply are based on evidence. 2 weeks ago I talked to Donald Hirsch, you might know him. He wrote a book, Why Knowledge Matters, and he says education in America is polluted because it's based on false assumption or false theories. And he elaborates in his books about the theory of finding the general idea is, well, it's not a tangible skill, and he elaborates more on those false theories. So that's why I'm asking, how do you make sure, especially for policymakers in the United States, that policy is based on true science, on evidence-based science?
I think it's really hard to do, because you'll have a body of science build up, and that'll lead to a policy. That policy will get embraced, and it'll be nested in a Democratic or Republican perspective. And after a year, 2 or 3 years, there'll be endless attacks on whatever that set of practices are. Science will also start popping up to support the political perspective. It gets very, very messy. And it's very seldom that we have science that's so strong it can't be attacked.
So is it maybe distraction to tell policymakers or to tell education everything we do should be evidence-based? Because that's a sound I hear a lot in the Netherlands right now. We need science-based decisions, otherwise it doesn't count. Is it maybe a distraction?
yes and no. I think that the intention of that is well meant. Um, and I think that what it leads to, however, is kind of an oversimplified assumption that you're going to get highly demonstrated, impeccable, unquestionable evidence for practice. And you will get some of that, but you will get a lot of stuff that's just not that clear. So again, I very much embrace the notion of bring as much science as we can to things. I also think that we have to be realistic about how the policy process actually plays out.
I see. Well, one question that pops into mind when we see the four quadrants, and you did research among those teachers, was there equal representation amongst the quadrants, or do you see more yellow teachers, let's say?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, because we didn't have large enough samples to test those kinds of things. We were basically in a theory building mode. But I think that that's pretty easily researched for people who want to get into that level.
Yeah, I can imagine. I wrote you one quote that I thought was the most beautiful quote in the book because I recognize myself in it, and that is I love teaching English because it gives me a vehicle to teach students how to be better people. If there was a course in just being nice and being a good person and knowing how to talk to people, how to make them feel good about what they're doing, how to make yourself feel good about what you're doing, I teach it. I'd love it. But they don't ever offer that in high school. They offer English. And the question that followed, the question I wrote underneath it, if you had to make a top 5 of most important things to teach children in high school, what would it look like?
Yeah, I think that I don't have any problem with the basic STEM topics and so forth. I think the arguments are made well. But there is something I learned from these teachers that to me is really important. Some of them were English teachers, some were history teachers, some were math teachers, but they were all excellent. And when you looked across them and said, what is it that holds across these teachers? They did not have jobs. They had callings. They weren't there teaching English, history, or math, although they may have loved history, English, or math. What they were doing was creating a love of learning. And basically what they were saying to us is, if you can teach a child to love learning, you empower that child the rest of their lives. Now, that's very inspiring, but it's very non-conventional. We are trained to think we're here to teach math, we're here to teach history. And that's what it's about. These people accept that, but they see beyond it. It's about excellence. It's about the love of learning. And to me, that's very, very powerful.
So that's exactly the quote I just read to you. That's what it's about, to
That's right. That's
make
right.
them into learners for life, with their own values, that people that value themselves, and mathematics and English is just a vehicle,
Yes,
and
that's
then
right.
you're allowed to be a teacher, and then the real work starts. But that's, I had the same motivation for teaching. So we've come to the last part, and that's the future. I want to have a look in the future. So you have been in the field for a long time, and are you still going to be in the field for a long time? What are your ambitions for the future?
Um, that's a good question. In terms of the formal role, I retired last spring. But in terms of what I'm doing, I'm actually teaching more hours this year than I did last year at the university, even though I retired. I'm writing a great deal, and I'm speaking a great deal. And I feel more generative today than I did 3 years ago. I feel like new ideas are coming to me constantly. And I absolutely love what I do. And every time I'm in front of a group, whether it's a management group or an education group or some other group, I feel like lights go on in the room. People start to understand things they didn't understand previously. And I find great, great satisfaction in that. And so I continue to do what I've done in the past.
So you continue to do what you did in the past. If you look at your own theory, are you consciously applying that theory in your own lesson practice?
My answer to that is a very strong yes. When I walk into a room full of executives, for example, I do not see myself as a teacher of management or leadership or change. My life purpose is to inspire positive change. Inspire does not mean to inform. The average person in front of the room thinks their job is to be an instructor. My job is to lead those people for an hour or 3 hours or whatever time it is, and to inspire them into making new assumptions about the world. So whether I'm teaching 12-year-olds or CEOs or a bunch of school teachers, I walk into that room trying to bring deep change into their lives by inspiring positive change and not by just instructing them.
And what quadrant are you in? Do you have a preference, or are you going all around?
Yeah, my long-term commitment, I often say that the competing values model is used all over the world. 99.9% of the time, they use it to differentiate. So in some company, they'll say, oh, you're a blue group. Oh, you're a red group. No wonder. So they differentiate it. Now, they really like that because they're communicating so much information in a few words. But the value of the model is not in differentiation. It's in the integration of differentiation, which most people don't even think about. And so when I'm anywhere and there's a conversation going on, I'm doing a factor analysis of the conversation, saying, well, they're covering the green quadrant and the red quadrant, but there's no yellow here, there's no blue here. And then I'll start asking questions that they usually find shocking because they're intelligent questions about their strategy around areas that they're not thinking about. I'm constantly trying to integrate differentiation across quadrants. And when you do, it has very high impact. So that's what that model is really about.
Great, nice answer. One of the last questions I want to ask you is the future of education, because technology is developing in such a quick and fast pace. It has great implications for education in the very near future, I think. Michael Fullen describes in his book that we need to be more agile as schools, and he refers to the lean startup model as one solution for education. How do you see the future? Where are we in, let's say, 20 years, and what should we keep in mind when we design our curriculum, for example?
I think that technological change is happening so rapidly that I have difficulty imagining even 3 years from now. I pick up my phone and I just look at the headlines in my news app, and every 10th one is such and such a company introduces new technology today. I think the reasons we have so many political problems, not just in the U.S., but across the world, is because we've actually arrived at Toffler's future shock. It now exists. And people can't process all the things that are happening. So I look at education and I see endless possibilities. They far exceed my imagination. And I don't think just public education, I think universities. That it's just staggering. And so I don't have specific answers to that question, but I do believe I have an optimistic reaction, because I think all of that change leads to continuous evolution, innovation, some of which will fail, some of which will succeed. But as those technologies emerge and they marry with some of the theories you've been talking about, I think they become avenues for those theories to get applied. So I don't claim to see the future of education, except to say that I'm optimistic about what technology can do.
Well, you're optimistic about what technology can do, but are you optimistic about the preparation that's going on? Is American education, let's talk about American education, are you ready for that transition, or are you already in that transition?
Well, I think the transition is going on. Whether or not we're ready for it is a totally different question. It's it's happening so fast that I think for any one administrator to keep up even is a great challenge. But the fact that it is happening forces people to try. So I have kind of a mixed model, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I've got two more questions, and I'm almost there. I told you we are redesigning our national curriculum. We're going to talk about language arts, about science, and 21st century skills and all. And a group of around 150 teachers are going to rewrite our national curriculum. Do you have any advice for that group of people?
If I were working with that, say there were 200 of those people in the room, and today they wanted to work on policy X or question Y, the value I would bring to them is I would not let them leap into a solution. Rather, I would put them through processes where they had to go do green solutions, red solutions, blue solutions, yellow solutions, and then talk to each other and come to rationale about why their combined solution is the best of what they've come up with. That is, I would lay on them differentiation. They would have to think more complex than they normally do, and then integration. And so it wouldn't be about content. It wouldn't be about topic X. It would be how they came to topic X.
Great. Well, let's see if I had all the questions. We are there. The question. Oh, I'm sure many people with me want to use this model, and the book is a great start. But are there any more tools? I mean, an app or a guide that gets us started as teachers?
Yes, Battelle for Kids has a website, and they have, for example, a card game that they play with teachers. They have videos. So I recommend going to that website and checking out what's there. Catherine Hanowski, one of my co-authors, is still there, and you can contact her, and I'm sure she'd be very helpful for teachers all over the world.
Yeah. Are there countries that have used your book that you know of in their school practice?
Um, Not that I know of, and that's partly because I've been distracted for a couple of years working on new stuff. I know Battelle has been taking it into various states in the country, but I just don't know about outside the country. Again, Catherine would be a good person to answer that.
Yeah, because you co-authored the book, so there's more people involved. And what you're
But
saying is, you you co-authored it, but the distribution and the spreading of ideas is in the hands of Battelle for Kids. So I
that's
want
right.
to know more. If I want to establish a cooperation stuff like that, I should contact Battelle for Kids.
Yeah, Catherine Hanowski in particular, she would be great.
I will certainly do that. So I want to end by thanking you for your elaborate story, for your research that you have done, and I'm sure that I speak for many people in Holland who have used your theories in companies, and now I hope in education. I surely will spread your theory and of your co-authors. Let's be honest. Um, so thank you once more for the work you do, and I hope to read a lot more and to see a lot more of you in the future.
Thank you. I
Okay,
appreciate what you're doing. It's very important.
okay. Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.